Good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name is Anthony Kazazis, and I'm the director of the NYC Network Group, as well as the NYC Real Estate Expo. And thank you for registering for How to Successfully Manage Your Self-Directed IRA. Real estate investors share best practices webinar sponsored by Next Generation Trust. Next Generation Trust company mission is to provide white glove customer service, ensuring their clients have the tools and support necessary to control their financial futures by investing with self-directed retirement plans. They fulfill this mission by educating individuals and their trusted advisors about the many options and benefits of self-direction and guiding their clients through the setup and investment process. Next Generation's personalized service ensures their clients receive the best possible experience with the prompt responses to their questions and abilities to reach a live person upon calling them. Today, we are joined with Brittany Melville, Director of Marketing and Sales at Next Generation Trust Company. Brittany will moderate this webinar today. She is alongside experienced real estate investors as they share their do's and don'ts of investing in the real estate through a self-directed IRA. Her panelists are Susan Konsella, real estate broker and a Next Generation client; Carl Schiovone, president of East Coast REIA and Next Generation client as well; jclark, ERISA attorney, partner at Blodnick, Fazio, and Clark; Robert Holeman, a real estate investor. Robert, let's start off with you. Can you give us like a 1-minute little bio on yourself and your company?
Yeah, how you doing? So Rob Holeman, I'm the owner broker of Floyd Harbor Real Estate, but I've actually been an investor, prior to becoming a broker, and I actually had to look up exactly when the first house was that I bought under a self-directed IRA, and that was 2012, so about 9 years ago. We've been doing that ever since.
Wow, that's great. Looking forward to hearing it, how you guys are doing it. jclark.
How you doing, guys? Jim Clark. I'm an attorney. I'm an ERISA attorney, and I got a question as to what ERISA is. Basically, that's the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. It's basically the governance of retirement money. It's been around since 1974, and it's a specialty. I represent landlords and active investors in my practice, and a lot of what we do in the transactions includes the compliant use of IRA funds. So that's what we're going to talk about here today. We're based in New York, my practice, but we help clients all over the country with this because it's a federal law nationwide. So that's what we do.
Susan Konsella.
Morning, everybody. I'm Susan. I am a real estate broker in the Denver metro area. Prior to becoming a realtor, I was a CPA for about 20 years. So when I learned that you could invest in real estate within a self-directed IRA, I immediately saw so many benefits to it. I wasn't a tax accountant, but it's really a great way to kind of make your life a little bit more stress-free and not have to worry about all the tax implications. And I've been able to grow my business just by educating clients and build a great client base of people who like to invest in real estate through their IRA, and as well as myself and my husband.
Oh, great. Thank you, Susan. And Carl Schiovone.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Anthony and Brittany, for inviting me. My name is Carl Schiovone, and I've been in the real estate industry. This is my 40th year now. And during that time, I've really invested in just about everything that you could invest in real estate. And that includes leveraging my self-directed IRA. I operate out of New York. And also, I am a real estate coach, as well as the founder and president of East Coast Real Estate Investors Association, which is basically an education and networking group. And it kind of reaches out to the local real estate investors as well as the support businesses. I'm really great to be here today and to share some tips with you. Enjoy the show.
Thank you, Carl. Brittany, give us a little write-up on yourself as well.
Just quick, Brittany Melville. If you've been on any of the other webinars in the series we presented over the past couple months, you've seen my face. I'm the Director of Marketing and Sales with Next Generation. We are a women-owned business in northern New Jersey. We've been in business about 16 years, and we are primarily focused on acting as a custodian and administrator for investors who are looking to use IRAs. So that includes providing education like we're offering today, holding the accounts, doing the tax reporting and all the record keeping on transactions as well. I have been with the company for about 4 years now, and I've been in marketing and sales positions in several different industries, including healthcare, finance, and consumer goods industries. I'm also a certified self-directed IRA professional in the field, so we look forward to providing you some good value here today.
Thank you, Brittany. Audience, I just want to make sure that if you have a question, please just type it up and put it right into Q&A, not into the chat box, but put it right into the Q&A. Just in case if we can't answer all the questions, I will copy them and I will send them to Brittany at Next Generation, and she'll be happy to answer any of those questions that we're unable to answer. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Brittany Melville.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for being with us today. As I mentioned, this is part 3 of a 3-part series that we offered on self-directed IRA education. The first part was basically a 101 for anyone who's new to the concept. And then the second part was a focus on specific types of real estate investments that could be done with a self-directed IRA. So today we are hearing from investors themselves and of course, attorney as well on how to best utilize the actual accounts themselves. Based on their experience. So today we're going to focus on 3 overarching kind of categories. One is asset acquisition with an IRA, so purchasing an asset like real estate. Then asset management, while that asset's in the account, how to best manage that, what you can and cannot do with that. And then sale of an asset at the conclusion of an investment. But just quickly for anyone who wasn't on the other 2 webinars, and is not really sure what a self-directed IRA really is, it is a retirement account like many others you might be familiar with that is distinguished by allowing you to invest in what we call non-publicly traded alternative assets. So you're not restricted to stocks, bonds, and mutual funds as you typically would be with many other popular retirement accounts. This allows you to broaden your options to include things like real estate and private equity, lending and partnerships, cryptocurrency even. Of course, today our focus will be on real estate, and we're going to talk about some of the benefits of utilizing the IRA as a vehicle for the investment. You could essentially, you could have several types of self-directed IRAs, traditional, Roth, SEP if you're a business owner, solo 401k as well if you're a business owner. And these accounts can be funded by rolling over funds from old employer plans or transferring from other existing IRAs that you might have. And then, of course, there are many different types of transactions that you can do. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But essentially, if you were looking to do something like this, best practice would be to establish your self-directed IRA and get that open before trying to make an investment. There is definitely a timeline associated with getting everything set up and funded. So just wanted to quickly explain that for anyone who wasn't on the other sessions, but we're going to dive right in. So first we want to talk about some thoughts about why an investor should use a self-directed IRA for real estate investing, right? So, and I think, Carl, you had a couple comments on this from our previous discussion, but if I'm an investor and I'm considering this, why would I use the IRA rather than just using my own funds as I might usually do?
Excellent. Well, we have done a number of projects, both partnering with my self-directed IRA or having the asset owned wholly by the self-directed IRA. And when you kind of look at that business model, it will allow you to kind of control at a better level your rate of return. You know, when you invest in other types of investments that are on Wall Street, you know, you're kind of going down the creek with whatever the tide is going to be pushing you in. But when you're leveraging your own self-directed IRA, you're evaluating a property, let's say it's a particular fix and flip. you know what that outcome is going to be, hopefully, in terms of your profit. So that's going to be more of a calculable investment, because you're going to know exactly what you're going to be getting out of that. When you look at the hold to rent business model, it's similar, because when you're looking at pulling that money from your self-directed IRA, and now perhaps that IRA being viewed as debt, it's going to be participating in that cash flow that rental property will be generating. So in both cases, with the fix and flip and the hold, it allows you to really have tremendous control over what that outcome can be. Furthermore, this also allows you to leverage other people's self-directed IRA to participate in your particular projects. So that's kind of the high level, and perhaps we have some other insights from others on that, but it has been a tremendous asset for us. There are, we know money today is really very easy and very available. However, why even give a private lender or a hard money lender or a conventional lender the money when you could be making that money on your own? So, for example, when we're partnering with our self-directed IRA, part of that investment is allowing me to benefit from that profit today by having a, outside the plan taxable event, and I'm making money today. And part of that is helping to build my future retirement. Okay, so that's kind of a little bit of a high level overview.
Thanks, Carl. Would anyone else like to add anything to that in terms of benefits that you've seen from using the IRA versus personal funds?
Yeah, I mean, just to reiterate what Carl said is if you are in a position where you are able to come across the deal and maybe you don't have the funds at the moment, it's not a hard sell to approach somebody and have them fund your deal, even if they are not liquid. They're in investments. They're in stocks, bonds, whatever that may be becoming volatile, or versus their cash account in a bank that's getting less than 1%. It's not a hard sell for me to have a conversation with somebody to say, would you like to fund my next deal? And so that's very powerful. And again, I love when you're looking at it from a perspective of having a steering wheel on your investments. Just like Carl said, you're in control if you're doing your own money. I mean, I do not own stocks. I do not buy stocks. I have no control over that. So that's what Carl said it best. I just want to reiterate and agree with what he said.
Thanks. Anybody else? I would echo that as well in terms of what we've seen in providing, obviously, service to these IRAs. There's the tax benefit, of course. So your investment earnings, if you're using your own self-directed IRA, your earnings are going to flow back into the IRA and thus be tax sheltered. So if you have a tax deferred IRA, then you're deferring tax on those earnings until retirement or time at which you decide to take them out. If you do have a Roth, which would grow earnings tax-free, that's also an amazing tool to be able to utilize, paying taxes up front on the initial fund into the Roth and then growing that tax-free from there. Again, and Rob mentioned volatility, hedging against some of the market volatility by having your funds further diversified outside, public securities and into alternatives which tend to provide more stable returns over a long period of time, and they're non-correlated typically with market returns. So it's thinking about this as a strategy long-term, of course, and also having that control over your own investments to be able to say, hey, I have skill in this area of real estate investing, for example, and I feel good about going out and finding deals that are going to perform well for me. And I believe that performance is going to exceed, or at least give me more control over what I'd get, putting it into one of the large corporations. Not that that's not a good strategy to do as well, but it's just another alternative to consider, another option.
Absolutely. Brittany, if I could just hitchhike off of, again, what you had said, one of the other extraordinary benefits of using your own self-directed IRA is really the speed of execution. Because if you have that money literally sitting in your operating account, that's certainly going to be the quickest way for you to react to a deal, especially if you're paying it all cash. You know, whether you're using a conventional lender or even a hard money lender, and sometimes even a private lender, it may take a little time for them to actually get you to that money. But when you have that money literally sitting in a checkbook, the speed of that reaction is going to be dramatically faster when it's sitting in your account.
And to touch on the tax issues that you were alluding to, Brittany, one thing that I like about it is that I've owned properties within an LLC, and obviously every year you have to do a tax return. You have to track depreciation when you sell the asset. You've got recapture. You have to, you know, think, do I want to do a 1031 exchange? And owning it within your IRA really just makes it simple. It just takes away a lot of those accounting headaches. And it's no different than owning a stock, and, you know, there's no taxes on it within your IRA. And it just makes it simple in the long run. And I believe actually more profitable in the long run without those tax implications and capital gains worries.
That's a great point that a lot of people may not think about as well, because we're so used to thinking about the regular reporting on real estate investments. And when that investment is held in an IRA, it's the reporting on IRAs is what applies, which is basically if you're not selling the asset, if you're not doing anything, if you're holding it for years in there and you're not doing anything that would constitute a taxable event, then there's no reporting required essentially, as long as it's in the IRA. So thank you, Susan. All right, let's move on to, Carl had mentioned partnering with IRA or partnering IRAs with other individuals. So in your experiences, and I think Jim, you and I may be able to comment on this as well. Commonly we get questions on what you can and can't do, or actually individuals are sometimes surprised to hear that they can partner. And partnering becomes popular in cases where you might not have enough cash in the IRA, you know, to solely own an asset. So what has been the experience with partnering and the do's and don'ts, best practices when it comes to that?
Well, when it comes to partnering, it's I guess it's the most common way to get leverage with an IRA, because everyone has only so much money in their IRA account or in their IRA LLC, and they may want to buy a property that, you know, requires more money than what they have. Getting a loan with an IRA can be problematic, which we might get into that a little later. So partnering really is the way to do it, because you can put your own money into a deal with your IRA. And, you know, and of course, it opens up a minefield of issues for me as an attorney that I see it. What I like to tell people, though, it's usually you could stay out of trouble if you think of yourself as being on the same side of the table as your IRA. You can't do business with your IRA across the table, like buying and selling from them. But if you're on the same side of the table, then usually it works. That's like the most general way of putting it. I could go on and on with all the exceptions and rules and everything else, but we'll continue on.
Sure. And yes, that's a good point about, I like that way of thinking about it, being on the same side of the table, and not directly transacting with your own IRA. For example, the IRS does have certain rules and restrictions around who the IRA can and cannot transact with. They have developed a list of who they call disqualified persons. And the account holder themselves is considered a disqualified person from the IRA, meaning you couldn't sell, you know, a property that you own in your IRA back to yourself, or you couldn't use your IRA to buy a property from yourself that you already own. And the same thing would go for anything that's owned by or related to a spouse or children, ascendants or descendants. those relationships, the IRS has a little bit more scrutiny over. However, it does allow for the partnering, as you said. So as long as you're not sort of commingling the funds in a way that you would be selling anything from one party to another or buying, but rather you're each of you are providing your own sort of stream of funding, and then each partner takes a percentage of ownership of that property or that asset, and that remains consistent for each partner so that they're contributing and receiving equal amounts, basically pro rata based on their ownership percentages. So it could be 50-50 split, it could be 10%, 90%, it could be anything, as long as the rules are followed, that those percentages remain consistent. And then there was a question about partnering with those who don't have IRAs, so that would pretty much answer that question. And IRAs, well, multiple IRAs could also partner as well, right?
Correct.
Have you ever seen that, Jim? Have you seen multiple IRAs?
Oh, yeah, yeah, I've seen multiple IRA LLCs doing business together, and it's the same rules apply. And
Right.
you know, administratively it can be a hassle, but you really have no choice with an IRA. And when I say it can be a hassle, it means the money goes in the same percentages but separate, and it comes out in the same percentages and separate.
Right. So expenses would have to be split
Correct.
between the partners.
Yeah, just to be absolutely careful with it, we usually recommend that 2 separate checks be written for every expense, one from each partner. On the deed, it's written, 50% this partner, 50% that partner, or 50, 15, 85%, whatever percentages are, and then it just follows down the line all the way. Records are kept separately, and then everybody stays out of trouble, and they get the use of this additional money on their deal.
And
Brittany, if I could just share one other strategy that kind of makes the partnering a little bit easier. You're also able to bring in a person that is just on the debt side and not on the equity side. So at that point, there just may be an underlying mortgage or a promissory note, and now you're just paying that person the fixed rate of return based on the agreement within the mortgage. That kind of keeps that person out of the actual project, and is just no different than a lien holder like Bank of America, for example. So that's another simpler way that you can almost get the same effect without them actually being engaged with the actual project. And that's worked for a lot of my clients of utilizing that strategy. The money that's coming in from the self-directed IRAs are coming strictly on the debt side, not on the equity side.
So Jim, do you see what Carl's talking about is like an investment, like a flip, it sounds like, but do you see partners on properties that are like a buy and hold situation for renting long term?
It's less common, only because of the administrative hassle I was talking about keeping everything separate. When you have to pay an electric bill every month and then writing 2 checks to the electric company, it gets a little bit cumbersome. So it's usually best suited for short-term deals, with exceptions. The only exception I've seen it work very well is more low-maintenance buy and holds. Like, say, if buying a commercial triple net property where once you buy it, there's really nothing you need to do but cash the rent checks. Then it works well, because then there's just, you're getting 2 checks, or 1 check to a management company, and then they go to the partners. It's when there's a lot of turnover in funds where it gets a little bit cumbersome.
Okay, thank you.
And to that point, you talked about fix and flips and buy and holds. Is there a suitable type of real estate deal for IRA funds? Residential, commercial real estate, is any specific type of investment more suitable than another?
Using IRA funds for private lending, that's probably the most suitable. And that's, when I say private lending, I mean short-term private lending. So like using your IRA as kind of like a hard money lender, just because they're very clean deals. Everything is documented, money in, money out, expenses, documentation, very easy. and it's short term, so you can then tie it up in a nice, neat bow with, this is what we invested, this is what we made, end of story. The other ones that are it's very suitable for are flips. And that's for the duration reason. It's very short term. Usually you're in and out in 6 months to at most a year. And then so you have everything, your expenses, what you made on the deal, nice and easy. It gets more problematic with the buy and holds, like I just mentioned, that has a lot of maintenance and upkeep that you'd have to pay for. Or anything else that needs to be fed excessively later on. Like I had a client once that did private lending, seemed great idea, but then the loan actually went bad and he had to foreclose, and he budgeted for the investment, but he didn't budget for fixing the investment when the thing went bad. And so it was problematic. I mean, we were able to get around it with by way of additional contributions, but you run into the minefields of the rules in those cases.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that also goes back to the importance of course, there's always some risk associated with any investment, no matter what you do, but the importance of investor doing their due diligence on the investments they're choosing as well, to hopefully mitigate some of that risk. That is something that is really important. And if it's, a note that can be secured by something, of course, that's ideal rather than not being secured. So we were talking about, Jim, you were talking about the splitting of expenses and such when it comes to partnering. Can you talk about how the structure of an IRA LLC might provide an alternative to having to split if there were multiple partners in that LLC? Does that make sense? The check.
Yeah, so you're talking about having multiple IRA accounts in a single IRA LLC.
Correct.
Yeah, that could definitely help because then everybody's funds are pooled in the LLC, one main LLC account, and then inflows and outflows will just be with a single check with that single LLC. What I see more often is that people will form their own individual IRA LLCs, and then they'll form a separate LLC as like the operating entity, because the IRA LLC has got a lot of benefits that they might want to take beyond a single investment. And, some of the benefits are really that you have more control. Like Carl was mentioning earlier, you just open up your checkbook and you can write a check for a deal. And like in real estate in particular, time is money, and if you're able to offer cash on the spot, you might get a better deal. Without the IRA LLC, every time you do a transaction, anytime you need to expend any funds, you would need to go back to your IRA custodian, go back to next generation, and there's an approval process to make sure that it's an appropriate expenditure and that it goes to the right place. That can take time. Although, next generation is probably one of the quickest out there that I've seen. It's not as quick as pulling out your checkbook and writing the check. So that's a big advantage to the IRA LLC. Downside is with that less supervision from an IRA custodian, there's more avenues to potentially get into trouble with a prohibited type of a transaction because nobody's looking over your shoulder. They find out about it after the fact when it could be too late.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we talked about best practices in partnering. We talked about disqualified persons. Were there any other comments on partnering and or IRA LLCs anything I missed that I didn't ask about?
Well, I would like to add one thing on the partnering, especially if it's with other people. And Jim can probably attest to this. There are really two elements of when something goes wrong with an investment. One could be the investment itself, and the other could be the partnership. So make sure if you're going to get on board with people that you have a very comprehensive operating agreement that's really citing not only the legal elements, of what a typical agreement would have, but also the day-to-day operation. For example, who's going to be there to watch the contractors, that level of detail, because I know as a coach, this is one of the areas that, I speak to a lot with my clients, because, you find multiple people that have money that they can effectively pool and go do a deal, not realizing that perhaps the most complicated aspect of that is making all of this come out right. You don't need 6 people to decide what color the kitchen should be painted. And I can tell you with a lot of experience that those types of things that are not clear can lead to a lot of drama. So that would be a good thing. And make sure that your attorney has reviewed that for the legality aspect of that as well.
That brings up a good point. Thank you, Carl. For IRA LLCs, this may be different across custodians, but often a custodian, and this includes Next Generation, will require that operating agreement be drafted specifically by an ERISA attorney. So it's not an option to necessarily go out there on the internet and grab any sort of like vanilla operating agreement. When IRAs are involved, there are specific provisions of the Internal Revenue Code that may need to be referenced or acknowledged. And that's important. So definitely something to keep in mind if an IRA LLC is option for consideration. All right, let's move over to asset management. So we purchased an asset. We've obviously we went into this in some of the other webinars, but in terms of working with a custodian to process that transaction to fund. Best practices on funding of the asset. Can I use, if I had a self-directed IRA, personal funds for down payment, and then have my IRA close on the property is a question we get often. Robert, can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think like an early deal, like one of the first deals, the problem was we didn't have an IRA ready to do that. In looking back, I think what ended up happening to stay compliant, and Jim maybe help refresh my memory, but I think what we did was we did lock up a property with personal funds, but what we ended up doing to stay compliant was we completely canceled the deal. They returned the money, and then 5 seconds later, the IRA went into contract. Simultaneously. Is that, I hope, I know we're talking public.
Yeah, it was about 3 seconds actually. Yeah, it's like, 2 pieces of paper next to each other, one canceling the old deal and one entering a new one. Yeah. That way they're not commingling. So sure.
And I think, Jim, we did a deal recently together where we assigned an opportunity to my self-directed IRA for 0 consideration. And that kind of allowed us to leverage the power of our cash in our pocket right now versus it ultimately going to our self-directed IRA.
Correct.
Oh, that's interesting. I like that.
Yeah, to Robert, to your point, it sounds like best practice to avoid some of the extra administrative hurdles is to ideally have the account ready to go and have the IRA ready to make the down payment.
Totally. Before you find the deal, because that could have cost us the deal. That was a $60,000 house that was worth a lot more. But it was not even an heir. It was a neighbor. It was like someone who said, you're gonna buy this house and I don't have to make it not smell like cat pee and I don't have to take all this stuff out. I don't care what you give me for it. Okay, we'll give you $60,000. Okay, and we made it easy on her. All the normal things that she would have had to do, but that could have killed the deal. She could have said, well, this is kind of funny and I don't understand it. And in the meantime, I have somebody else that offered me 100. And again, this is 9 years ago. This was the first deal. But yeah, by all means, get it set up before you find the deal. Right now, if you find a deal and you're not ready to go, it is too late because 5 seconds later, they're getting offers that are much higher in this market.
Yeah, that happens all the time. And sometimes one of the hesitations for opening the account before finding the deal is like, well, do I have to fund it within a certain period of time? Like, what if I don't have an investment in mind? And the answer is, with self-directed IRAs, by nature, they're self-directed, so you can fund it whenever you want, essentially. I mean, of course, it would, be most beneficial to have something on the horizon, but it doesn't have to be immediately funded, and there's no specific minimum funding that has to be put in. So it's really driven by the investments that you want to do. But at least having the account established is going to save you that time, so that when you have a deal in mind, then it's just, let's get the funds in and let's get the paperwork together for this deal.
Absolutely.
At least have some down payment money in there.
Yes, and that can be.
And let's remember, in New York, that realtors have an obligation to bring a bona fide buyer in presenting an offer, which would include proof of funds. So if you haven't funded anything yet, what is that proof of funds that you're going to show them? So it's no different. If we akin it to a regular transaction, no realtor is going to present an offer to a seller that doesn't have proof of funds of some sort. So this is really an important get ready position that you should start out with before you even start your real estate search.
If I could, I'd like to just speak to something that Jim said earlier that might be scaring some people on the call. There may be some people that want to pull the trigger on starting an IRA. Maybe they're not sure that they can find a deal soon, but maybe they want to fund someone else's deal, but they're scared because Jim said there was a lender that he had to foreclose on. I'm just going to spitball here with you, Jim, but let's say I was borrowing money from somebody, but I wanted to make them feel warm and fuzzy inside that they were never going to have to foreclose on me. What if they formed an LLC to take control and I wasn't on title? We just had an operating agreement that says you're the lender and I'm making most of the profit, but here is what you get out of the deal. And if I don't do what I say I'm going to do, I have no control over the property outside of the operating agreement. Would that negate the need to foreclose in this market?
Oh, sure. Yeah, there's all kinds of things we could do to avoid the enforcement issues. Getting on title, that's the best way. I apologize if I scared anybody, but my business is nobody calls me when everything is okay, unfortunately. So, but yeah,
well, that's your job. You're supposed to tell us worst case scenario.
Yeah, exactly. I got to look at these things with a chip on my shoulder. But there are ways to make any deal safe. Unless it's just you got someone who has bad faith toward you. Usually, when you start a deal, everybody's wants it to work. That's why they're doing it. That's the best time to structure it, similar to the way you just proposed.
Right. So if somebody was in that situation and wanted to fund something, even if they couldn't find a deal right now, they could fund somebody that does have a deal.
Absolutely.
And along those lines, if I could add, you mentioned people who don't necessarily want to fund their IRA because the deal's not there yet. Well, like Robert said, just have your down payment money ready to go, because if you're waiting for the right deal, you're never going to find it. You have to be set up, have to have all the pieces in place, and that deal will come to you then, is kind of how I feel. It's basically you're kind of creating your own destiny by just having that account ready to go. Then the deal will come. Does that make sense?
Fund it and they will come.
Yeah.
Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, they're very easy structures to use once they're set up. It takes a little time to set them up though. So if someone's thinking about doing it, I usually recommend set it up with a little bit of money. And that way, your structure is set up, the flow of funds is going to go a lot easier when you do have a deal. So that way you can kind of keep your foot in the market on one hand and, the ability to transition to real estate on the other if something comes up.
Right. And it's kind of about eliminating some barriers too. My husband and I have this joke. He's a little bit less risk averse than I am. And for years, he's told me, you're always finding a reason not to do something. So I've learned to kind of shift my mindset. And he's right. If you give yourself reasons why it's not going to work, it's not going to work. But if you go into it with the attitude that I'm going to invest with my IRA, I'm going to get my account set up, then you will be more open when that first deal comes along.
Yeah, taking the first step. I think a lot of people hesitate to do that. Great. Just in the consideration of time, I just want to jump over to the question about financing. We talked about putting down a down payment. If the IRA doesn't have sufficient funds to pay in cash, what are the options for financing if the IRA is on title to the property?
I have had good luck here in Colorado going to local banks and sometimes credit unions. And they definitely have their funding requirements. I think for the first deal I did, I had to put up, I think 35 or 40% of the money. But then I was able to get a loan quite easily. And the interest rates are slightly higher than if you're borrowing as an individual. But I would say seek out smaller banks that have a little bit more flexibility, perhaps. And you've got people who are a little bit more motivated in those smaller banks or credit unions to get a deal done than a large bank.
What I am seeing is that the financing options are much more available outside of New York because this financing would have to be non-recourse. And I think there's only one lender that I even know in New York that's willing to do it in New York, and their LTVs are significantly reduced. They're only lending based at about a 40% LTV. So just make sure that whenever you're doing a project, that your exit strategy for that project is really thought out. If you're gonna, utilize the Burr strategy, for example, maybe buying it with your all self-directed IRA cash, but now you want to put financing on it, you better make sure that you can get that financing before you move forward with that project, because that non-recourse issue is a big barrier, especially in New York.
Probably hence why the partnering option tend to be more common as an alternative to the non-recourse.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move over to, not that we want to scare people again, Jim, but it's important for everyone to be educated. So this is why we need people like Jim. And this is why we have these conversations. We talked a little bit about IRS rules and regulations and prohibited transactions with IRAs involved in investments. What types of prohibited transactions have you found to be common in real estate deals? And what are the options if you uncover one? What are the options to try to resolve them, or the consequences for not being able to?
Okay. Well, I guess the most common prohibited transaction is doing a transaction with, what you termed as a disqualified person earlier, which is basically anyone that's related to you, a spouse, someone who could take from your estate, like a lineal or ascending or descending descendant, or ascendant or descendant, either way. So those are doing business with a disqualified person. So that means like buying or selling a property to yourself or someone like that. Another instance is basically we just kind of glossed over it, but non-recourse loan. If you were to instead get a loan and personally guarantee it, that's considered a prohibited transaction. I see that often. But the most common one is say you have a project going, like a rehab or a flip, and you have to buy materials, you have to pay a contractor, and you use your personal funds for that particular deal. That's the most common prohibited transaction. Are you able to fix them? Sometimes you can. There's a very tight timeline to do it, and if you catch it within that timeline, you can do almost like a reverse transaction, document it. Sometimes you have to treat the transaction as an additional excessive contribution, like say if you contribute too much money to an IRA account. That's another way to fix it. There's penalties involved with most of this stuff, so we try to avoid the prohibited stuff with a 10-foot pole. But if it does happen, then we just try to mitigate those penalties. Worst case scenario, your IRA ends up becoming like basically gets distributed completely. It's no longer an IRA. And if you're not of retirement age, then basically you're paying that, whatever you're getting out of that is income. Plus there's a penalty. So you wanted to be scared, you know, that's it. So, and this is what all these rules are intended to avoid, because you get a lot of privileges, a lot of benefits from using retirement money. So the consequence of that is that you have to follow these rules. And if you don't, then you lose all those benefits. And that's usually how it works.
Thanks, Jim. Carl, I know we talked about this recently. You had called me some months ago about this. And I imagine that listeners may have questions about this too. When trying to manage a property owned in an IRA, what are the limitations? So what are some of the things that might be different that someone couldn't do, or if they owned it themselves or through their own LLC, they'd be able to do it? And what are some of the things that are still okay for them to do that we could reassure them?
Well, I think it kind of can be grouped together as that you really can't do anything that's going to be benefiting the IRA. For example, the sweat equity issue. You can't go in there and buy a property and start to paint it on your own when your self-directed IRA owns that. So the physical aspect of the work is really where I believe the most prohibited actions are. But when it comes to management, there is still leeway for you to manage a project. For example, if it was a fix and flip, you're able to be the general contractor from the standpoint of getting quotes, things of that nature, to make sure that it's going well. If it's a rental, to be able to interview tenants, collect rents on behalf of that. But once you start doing work that's improving that asset, I think that's kind of that fine line. And maybe someone else may be able to comment about, you know, the legalese of that, but we stay away from doing anything other than the management or oversight of our projects. Okay. And that's generally when, you know, the self-directed IRA owns it outright. When it gets to be where you're partnering with your self-directed IRA, it can get even a little bit more muddied from there. But in general, you know, most investors, you know, and this is the coach in me speaking, you shouldn't be doing sweat equity on your properties anyway. If you're an investor, you should be out looking for other deals, not, you know, trying to connect your toilet bowl. So it shouldn't really have a bearing on. And I know some new investors, they may want to get excited about rolling their sleeves up, but obviously there are some restrictions with regards to the IRA.
I would agree. Susan, as it relates to property management, how do you, this is, I guess, more of a general sort of best practice question, but this could apply to the IRA as well, right? How do you create a list of go-to contractors, and do you recommend property managers, or do you try to self-manage with the IRA's properties?
Well, and Robert can chime in too as an investor. We do manage our rental properties ourselves, and, you know, keep in mind all the rules and regulations that Jim and Carl have covered by hiring contractors. But I think for us, the best way is to develop that list of contractors, just to start asking people, you know. When you're first getting involved in owning your own rental properties, not to go into too much detail, but I think it is a little daunting. It's one of those things, well, I'm never going to be able to find contractors, so this isn't going to work, right? You just start asking people. I find word of mouth is the best way to solve any problem you have. Just talk to people you know. One thing that I've seen other investors do recently, and I don't know in New York what the situation is, but in Colorado, there's a lot of home warranty companies that for a couple $100 a year or $500 a year, you can get a home warranty on the property. And then if anything goes wrong, like say the hot water heater goes out, your tenant can call the home warranty company and they send somebody out to do the repair. So it takes a little bit of those details off the owner. And it's also kind of a time saver too, because you've got a company right there that can take care of your problem for you. So I found that that's a good solution for investors who are busy people. And like Carl said, you know, that is a type of sweat equity when you're micromanaging details about, you know, getting a plumber in to make a repair, or, you know, hiring an HVAC company to come in and do a furnace. But a home warranty company can sometimes, if they're available to you, alleviate a lot of that problem.
I love that idea, Susan. I haven't even thought about putting home warranties on rental homes. I certainly put warranties on every refrigerator, because that's always what breaks and is an emergency in a tenant situation. You know, wash machine, it's okay to take a couple of days to fix it, but a refrigerator has got to work. So I'm gonna look into that. Thank you.
Yeah, of course, of course.
As far as contractors, you know, I mean, I feel like, you know, I mean, I've been an investor for over 20 years, and I feel like, what am I doing wrong? I'm always struggling with contractors. And then, you know, about 5 years ago, I'm in a REIA meeting with Carl, and he, from the front of the room, he says, you know, I've been doing this 35 years and contractors are still a problem. So I felt like, oh, maybe it's not just me, but everybody I talk to seems to have that problem. And I'm always hiring. And unfortunately, yeah, we do need to fire sometimes. These contractors that are good for years, one day they're not good. They either price themselves out or they become unreliable. So I try to, here's one hint, and I use it and it works. I try to, if you are desperately looking for contractors, do not drive past a house that is undergoing a full renovation without walking up and introducing yourself to the contractors and asking, I'm an investor. You know, I own rental houses, I flip houses. Can I afford you? 50% of the contractors will say, nope, I only do retail, and will exclude themselves right there. The other 50%, you can kind of interview and get a sense for whether you're a match or not. But that works for me.
Just one other point with finding the contractors, and to Rob's point, I'm now in this 40 years and contractors are still my biggest problem. So that problem's never going to go away. But remember, before you start investing, you need those contractors readily available, because if you're doing a fix and flip, for example, through your self-directed IRA or even not, you need to get that contractor out there to give you a quote. You don't be making offers on a property without knowing what your remodel budget's going to be or what your make ready costs are going to be for a rental. So just like we talked earlier about getting your self-directed IRA in a ready mode, you need to get your contractors in a ready mode as well. Okay.
Yeah, and to Susan's point, you should start with your sphere of influence for sure.
Absolutely.
Ask everybody I know, who do you recommend? Who's done work on your house? That's always the go-to first. Anything I'm talking about is to fill in the blanks after you exhaust those crews.
Oh, another suggestion. Do you all have Ace Hardwares out there?
Yeah.
Ace Hardware stores. So through a personal connection, I met a couple that started a company here in Colorado called Handyman Matters. And basically they own a company where they hire skilled contractors. They have plumbers, tilers, HVAC guys, anything and everything that work for them. So if you have a need, you just call this company. And I found out recently that Ace Hardware, they were franchising, or my acquaintances were franchising this business idea, and Ace Hardware bought them out a couple of years ago. So if you have an Ace Hardware in your area, look into their handyman services, because that would be one-stop shopping too, kind of like the home warranty.
Lots of good stuff here. Anthony, I see you're back. I take it that means we're running out of time, and I know we have a handful of questions.
Correct. Yeah, thank you, everybody. This was great. You do have a lot of questions. I am going to say to Ralph, Daniel, Patricia, Edward, Salvatore, Rosanna, and Sophia, I am going to have Erica and Brittany reply to your questions after this webinar, okay? And they will get back to you on detail on each one of these questions. Jeremy, you asked a question for Susan. How are the home warranties to deal with advised in Tennessee that they can be a less responsive than the managing agents contractors? Susan?
So basically the question is that the home warranty is not responsive, or would they be more responsive?
How are the home warranty to deal with advised in Tennessee that they
okay.
can be a less responsive than the managing agents contractors? That's from
Well-
Jeremy Neimer.
Okay, Jeremy, I think you just need to, I would have both ready to go. I mean, if you're finding home warranties are not as responsive, then I would go a different path. I would say the biggest downfall to a home warranty is doing something that voids the warranty, like calling a different contractor to come make a repair before you call the home warranty company. That's not been my experience. The home warranty companies that I've dealt with and that my clients have dealt with have been responsive. There are certain things, like Robert said, like a refrigerator, you just want to always have that, you know, established that you have a plan for something like that. But it can take a contractor, any contractor, a couple of days to get out to check a problem, and a home warranty company is no different. So I would say there's no perfect answer. You just have to find a solution that works best for you.
Thank you, Susan. Oliver Ross, regarding a fix and flip, are there rules, IRS rules on how long you have to hold it?
Quick answer on that is no. You can hold
That was
that
quick.
as long as you like.
That was quick. Thank you, Jim. Norman Rosen, when do you need to go to next gen, and when can you simply write a check? I guess Brittany?
So to Jim's earlier discussion about the IRA LLC, if you chose to go the route to set up the LLC, once that LLC is funded by your IRA, which you would have to work with Next Generation to do in terms of getting the funds out of your IRA into the LLC's business checking account. Once the funds are sitting in that business checking account, that's the point at which you don't need to go to Next Generation for authorization on a transaction. And within that LLC, you can write checks to purchase actually just about any asset that's allowed in an IRA. You could have multiple properties in that LLC. You could have, a fix and flip. You could have a buy and hold. You could do lending with that same LLC. You could do multiple investments, but each of those, once the LLC is funded, you could do through writing your own checks using the account.
Thank you, Brittany. Jeremy says, thank you, Susan. Let's go to Sophia. We have a little more time. We have about 2 more minutes. Fairly new to this. Can you highlight the benefits of using your own money in self-direction, IRA versus the bank's money?
The question is benefits of using your own self-directed IRA rather than getting a loan from
Sophia.
the bank using your personal funds.
Correct.
Well, I think probably anybody on the panel could answer that if you'd like to.
Well, I'll touch on it. I think we mentioned it a little bit earlier before. First of all, going to a bank, even a hard money lender, there's going to be a certain underwriting process and having that money readily available. Unless you have some sort of line of credit, which you're writing off of a checkbook. But clearly from a financial benefit, whatever profits or interest that you've agreed to pay your self-directed IRA, that's going to you and not to Bank of America as bank fees or interest payments. So optimizing your total effective rate of return will dramatically increase because you're getting all ends of the profit stream. That's probably the best, simplest answer there. If anyone else wants to jump in.
Yeah, thank you, Carl. Guys, that concludes our webinar. Again, I am going to definitely, the ones that we were unable to ask and answer those questions, Erica and Brittany from Next Generation will reply back to your questions. I want to thank everybody. You guys were all fantastic. I want to thank Brittany and Next Generation as the sponsor. You guys really put together a fantastic webinar. And this concludes the webinar. Thank you, Brittany. Thank you, Next Generation. Thank you, crew. Thank you, Susan, Robert, Jim, Carl.
Thank you
very
for
much.
having us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye
Yes.
now.
Bye-bye, guys.